Entry 33, it's another longer one. It's 3 pages, and this is dated Tuesday, June 16th, 1964. You divide this particular memo into 6 areas, so I think we'll kind of touch on each one briefly. Tell us a little bit about Area 1.
In Area 1, there was a draft that had been prepared by Ireland Spector, which was quite good, but I had some suggestions with respect to modifications, and I wanted to ask Ireland to participate in that effort, and I called him up, and he came down to consult with Rankin and discuss his draft, and he then volunteered to revise the drafts and footnote them appropriately. So he was very cooperative in coming back and accepted the recommendations we were making, and I'm sure we moderated them to some degree to reflect his own judgment. In the Area 2, we have a continuation of the dispute between Ball and Bellin on one hand and Rankin and on the other, still having problems about how to present the evidence, and here this indicates that Norman had prepared an alternative outline dealing with the chapter of the evidence against Oswald. And we have some minor issues about where to deal with the handling of the press by the police department, the refutation of allegations made by Lane and Buchanan, and so forth. But it was decided that Norman was going to proceed to draft this chapter along the lines of his outline over the next several days. With respect to Area 3, I reported that Rankin had learned from the Chief Justice that he'd given a Dutch uncle talk to Jenner, which was a common phrase used for the severe Dutch uncle who would enter the picture to instruct his nieces and nephews how to behave. So it evokes a conversation with the chief and Jenner, which I'm sure should have been videoed at the time for historic value. And Jenner promised his report, and this item refers to Mr. Mosk helping Jenner prepare a thoroughgoing a memo about Oswald's life. Richard Mosk was our first associate, and I may have mentioned this in an earlier discussion, and he did work largely in Area 3 during his time on the commission, though he might have branched out a little bit near the end. So, and at this point it says that Liebler was focusing on motive, whereas Jenner, aided by Mosk, was sort of dealing on facts from which you might make some judgments regarding a conspiracy. So there was a lot of work to be done.
Before you move on to Area 4, Area 3, Mr. Jenner, you might speak very briefly to the level of detail with which he was approaching his Oswald biography.
Yes, Burt Jenner was doing a very thorough job in interviewing everyone who'd had any contact whatsoever with Oswald since his return. And I forget whether his research also extended to people who had some connection with Oswald or his mother before he defected. But there was some murmuring among other staff members as to whether this was worthwhile. And in retrospect, I think it clearly was worthwhile because Jenner's detailed interrogation provided a fodder of history that later investigators and novelists or writers depended on with respect to Oswald's life in Dallas and the relationships with the members of the Russian-speaking community. I should say with Mr. Jenner that he made enormous sacrifices in his serving on the commission, and one of which, probably never officially reported, was that he really sacrificed, to some extent, his opportunity to become the president of the American Bar Association because of his commitments to the commission. And the schedule of those ABA meetings made it difficult for him to both participate aggressively in a campaign to become president or to fulfill his obligations at the commission. So I think that he was also a very good colleague and age differences were of no significance to him. He was eager to get to know you despite your age and background.
All right, so Area 4, tell us about this.
In Area 4, this reflects the fact that David Slauson had been carrying the burden in the area, and this does highlight the fact that I asked Mr. Mosk to divide his authorities between Group 3 and Group 4, that he could help David complete some of his work. And in addition, Stuart Pollock, the assistant that I had hired for the Criminal Division, was going to assist in this area by reviewing and revising a preliminary draft dealing with the Mexican investigation. And in Area 5, that is, of course, the most substantial problem and is identified as such in the journal. And I had a discussion with Hubert and Griffin with respect to their introduction to their chapter, and I quote from the journal: "It became clear at this point that the attorneys in this area had not had a sufficient investigation and had no clear thought as to what the substance of their report should consist of. The following weeks resulted in much agonizing about the situation and a directive to get all the investigative requests out to the FBI as soon as possible." So that was the stimulus for a concentrated period of work by Bert Griffin, the result of which is discussed, I think, later on in terms of the number of investigative requests that he and Hubert submitted to me for delivery to the FBI. There's other materials here, and it notes also that I added a new law clerk, Murray Lawlick, who had just graduated, and I forget whether he had just served a clerkship or whether he was scheduled to have one, but he had been recommended to me by a friend at the Justice Department, and he turned out to be a very valuable participant also in taking drafts, editing them, and working hard.
The way this reads, it sounds as though Mr. Hubert and Mr. Griffin weren't really doing a good job, but it's not really that. They just had so much they had to cover and they were behind?
Well, I think that's true, and also in the last few sentences, it reports that Mr. Hubert had long since left the commission. I don't think it was that long, but it might have. It was probably at least two and maybe 3 weeks earlier where he did leave the commission to return to New Orleans and wrote a very favorable goodbye note to the members of the staff, complimenting them on their discipline and their hard work. So as a result, it seemed to offend Rankin and the Chief Justice. I don't quite understand why that was the case. And subsequently, in fact, Rankin asked Hubert to take some depositions in Dallas, and Leon stepped forward and did that very effectively and promptly. So there were just so many issues that had to be explored in Area 5 that I did want to provide additional manpower to the area.
And then Area 6, back to presidential protection.
At this point, it's unclear exactly what Sam Stern had gleaned or learned from his exchanges with the Department of the Treasury, but Chief Rowley did testify on June 18, and Sam was waiting until that appearance in order to really complete a draft a report for review by Rankin. I still thought that the Commission had to deal with the question of transferring the responsibilities of the Secret Service to the FBI in the field of presidential protection, but my note says, quote, "Neither of them seemed particularly enthused about discussing this issue in the report," end of quote. It might be useful to just stop for a minute and talk about Rowley's appearance before the Commission. That took place a week or so after this. Actually, it was only a few days, I guess, from the date of this memo. Chief Rowley testified, and in response to questions from the commission, he conceded and acknowledged that several of the agents assigned to the protective detail of the president on November 22 had violated agency directives not to drink any alcohol while you're preparing for or in the midst of a protective assignment. And several of the agents were known to have been in a bar late at night into 1 and 2 in the morning of November 22. And I forget whether this was brought to our attention through the press. I think it probably was. And what was of concern to the commission was first to what extent did this limit the effectiveness of the agents who had stayed up so late in the night before the motorcade. And the second issue was, well, what punitive steps did Chief Rowley take to discipline these men who had violated the agency's rules? And he said that he, after consideration, had decided not to administer any punishment to any of these offending agents. He explained his position to the effect that he did not want to have these agents and their families tarnished for the rest of their lives because they would be perceived as causing or allowing the assassination to take place. So with that concern in mind, he decided not to punish them and thought that their own sense of guilt and might, achieve the purposes of disciplining them not to do it again. So that was a very important disclosure to the members of the commission who were able, with that in mind and by questions to Chief Rowley, were able to assess him as a leader and as a sufficiently competent director of such an important agency. Sadly for Chief Rowley, he answered all the questions of the members of the commission by asserting time and time again that his agency had performed perfectly on the day, that they were under no requirement to put people in the windows of buildings along the route, since they did that only for motorcades in Washington, D.C. He thought the liaison with local law enforcement agencies were perfect, although Congressman Ford repeatedly emphasized the lack of any written memorandum that laid out specifically the responsibilities of those different agencies when such a motorcade was in their city. And in several other respects, he indicated that a reluctance, or perhaps it was just a complete belief on his side that everything had performed according to the best policies and practices, and that it was just a bad luck. I mean, he was examined, for example, why is it that 6 people saw a man with a rifle in the window, and none of those 6 happened to be a member of the Secret Service, right, or to be fair, a member of any law enforcement agency. So the commission members who supported transfer of responsibility thought their case had been substantially enhanced by Rowley's behavior. Mm-hmm. But the obstacles within the commission and Secretary Dillon, of course, by this time, had developed defensive mechanisms that made transfer really not a serious alternative.
Despite saying, though, that that the Secret Service performed perfectly in Dallas, he does mention in his testimony that since the assassination, they've conducted in his words, a complete re-examination of the operations of this intelligence operation. So clearly, even though they behaved perfectly in Dallas, he recognized that there were some deficiencies.
Well, I guess that's why, right? I mean, we knew that there was such a thing called the Rowley Report, yeah, and that's what he's referring to here. But we didn't know then, and never did get to know exactly the respects in which he thought there could be improvement. Perhaps they were what showed up at the last moment as Dillon's program, namely bringing into the agency people who had experience with other intelligence agencies so as to facilitate communication between and among agencies. Perhaps it was the need to add more personnel on the street during the course of such a motorcade or similar public event. So we do not know, and but you're right. I mean, he thought there were remedies that he could agree to.
And he mentions funding being a major issue.
Right. Well, it's it's a typical government response. Give us more money, we'll do a better job.
In the last sentence of this, after you get through the different areas, you just briefly mentioned getting a subpoena out to Weissman, that being Bernard Weissman, who funded and co-wrote the black-bordered inflammatory advertisement in the morning news. As I recall, Weissman appeared before the commission very reluctantly, but he had an attorney present and was one of the very few who had counsel. Do you have any memories of that at all?
No, I do not have any memories of that. I do know that Weissman's still alive and has been interviewed by someone who's preparing a film about the Warren Commission report and the work of the staff, and he enlarged his subjects by finding Weissman and having a very fruitful interview as to who he was and why he had done what he did, because Weissman, of course, as Bert Griffin emphasizes, was the cause of Ruby's personal investigation on Friday and into Saturday to find out who Weissman was, because he was offended by the fact that someone with a Jewish name would have a display of disavowing and attacking President Kennedy's positions. So Ruby spent time trying to find Weissman by interrogating various rabbis in the community. In any event, so Weissman is alive and well, and has had his chance recently to spell out exactly how he figured in this drama.
All right, we'll go ahead and move to the next entry.